We welcome in now David Jones on the phone. He is a longtime observer of the Penn State program. He writes for the Harrisburg Patriot-News. David joining us, I understand, from Philadelphia. But David, I heard you on the conference call earlier today with Jim Delaney and Sally Mason. I know you've been monitoring this closely. What are your thoughts about what's happened to the Penn State program today?
Well, it's going to be crippling, Dave, initially, and I think the best guy to talk to something like this is probably Jerry, who I know is trying to imagine what it would be like to have this sort of situation where you're down 10 scholarships every year for 4 years and trying to make a go of it. As a recruiting task, it's just going to be mammoth and crippling up front, and you have to just work through it, commit, get your staff to commit, because that could be a really dispiriting thing over time where so many doors are closed to you. Recruiting's become kind of a viral thing where kids want to be with other really good kids, and it's so easy for them to communicate now. It's almost, we were talking in here in Comcast about it's almost like all the cool kids wanting to go to the same party. And when they start leaving, that can be viral too, and I'm sure it will be here in the next few days and weeks. So at some point they're going to know what they have to deal with, and at least they can begin, even though the task is just going to be so mammoth.
David, we're just getting a sense of Bill O'Brien. We'll obviously get to know him a little better in the days and years to come. My reading of his contract, and I looked through it yesterday, is that he has no escape clause for any harsh NCAA penalties like this. It would be prohibitively expensive for him to get out of his contract. So the sense is that he is locked in there unless, of course, there is some sort of a change to that contractual language. What is your sense of him and of his ability to deal with what you describe as kind of a mammoth task ahead of him?
Yeah, correct. We went through that yesterday. Bob Flounders actually did for us. And what he saw basically were a loss of bowl incentives and tack-on payments that could add up to $200,000 each, I think, up to about $800,000, but no real escape clause, no way for him to get out of this. Today he has made a statement that he knew when he accepted the position that there would be tough times, but he's committed for the long term to Penn State, and he sounds like he's in it for the long haul. Of course, there's going to be people knocking on his door from the NFL. He's a really well-regarded coach, and maybe they could buy him out. That's also possible in the next 2 or 3 years if he just gets so demoralized by it, because this is going to be a demoralizing situation. You're used to recruiting and teaching elite athletes who can do the things you need them to do to succeed, and now you just can't. You have a limited number. Not only that, but the kids who are there who can play, they get dispirited because there are other kids next to them who just can't do the things that they can do. It becomes demoralizing all the way around. It's going to be really, really tough. But he says he's in it for the long haul.
David, you followed this story as close as anyone the last couple of years. What were your biggest surprises today when Mark Emmert spoke?
I knew pretty much what he was going to say as far as sanctions. I was actually a little bit surprised that the sanctions on scholarships were as low as they were. I was anticipating even worse, believe it or not. But that was the one figure I'd not heard ahead of time to give me a sort of a ballpark. That was kind of out in the open. So 40, reduction of 40 over 4 years actually sounded reasonable and workable, even though it's just so massive. I got to ask you. I mean, can you? Since I have you on here, I'm curious. How do you feel about trying to make a go of this as a head coach? Isn't it going to be just insurmountable in the near term?
Well, you know, nothing's insurmountable. This is certainly a challenge. I think it changes the way you do day-to-day business. And interestingly enough, you know, Bill O'Brien's experiences with the NFL, and Howard and I were talking about this, smaller rosters. So there's some things that he may be more equipped to do than, say, maybe a veteran college coach, because he's going to practice with smaller rosters. It may be shorter practice. They may go about their business a different way. The recruiting is also interesting. I think they're going to have to change their evaluations. As you know, they're off to a great start this year. I'm guessing they're going to lose some of those commits, but they're not going to have an audience with the elite players in the future that they were having so far this year. So they're going to have to change their evaluation and recruiting as well.
Yeah. And what I was thinking about is, I guess you have to keep your eyes on the future, 3 or 4 years off in the future. Of course, I was thinking about Kentucky basketball in the late 80s after the Sutton sanctions and what Rick Pitino did there. Of course, it wasn't such a long sanction. But of all people, the rabid UK fans kind of developed an attachment to those mutts that he was recruiting in there who just weren't as good. And I think they went 13-13 one year, and every win was like a gift. And of course, that team, the core of that team, became the unforgettables. When they recovered, was endeared to that school as any players who've ever been there, and they ended up retiring their numbers. John Pelfrey and those guys. So I guess the only way you can approach something like this is just to look at the long term and think of what could happen if you make it through to the other end. Think of the reward.
I think if you're going to make that comparison, David, I think you could also use the metaphor in this league of Indiana basketball. Again, it was different, but you look at the wake of Kelvin Sampson and how few players they had left, and how few of them were anywhere near the caliber that you would expect of Indiana basketball. And there were some very, very lean years with an equally rabid fan base to the one you're describing. And now you go into this season, there are some people who think they're the preseason #1 team in the country. Yeah,
the difference with this and those two cases is that the basketball, all you need is a couple, 3 guys who can really play. And Jerry's probably nodding because you can't do it with just a couple, 3 guys in football. You need a breadth of guys. And that's going to make this different, as will the 4 years instead of just 2. It's going to be really, really tough in the short term.
No, it's crippling. There's no doubt about it. The last thing I want to ask you, David, as an observer of this program, we've seen this fall of the icon now of Joe Paterno. We saw the literal fall of the icon yesterday as the Joe Paterno statue came down, but certainly the perception of Joe Paterno is so very different from what it was in the years that you've covered this program. How are you reacting to this? How are you kind of reconciling this in your head?
The thing is, when you're around somebody for 22 and 23 years, you don't build them up as this deity, this icon, as people do who see them as some sort of remote hero, who are never really around them and only see the image. So while I'm stunned by all of this, in the last 2 years has been just a roller coaster ride, an incredible tsunami for our paper and everyone around here. I'm not so disillusioned, I think, as the fan base who saw him as something special. I saw him as a guy with attributes and failings both, and a lot of people who grew up idolizing him saw him as something else entirely based on an image that could be accurate and sometimes wasn't accurate. So I guess that's my answer in a long form, but I'm not as completely stunned maybe as someone who's not around somebody. To us it was almost like an old marriage at times. You're around somebody that long, you see a lot more than someone who's just seeing the image.
David Jones from the Harrisburg Patriot-News. Appreciate your time. Thanks, David.
You're very welcome, Dave.